The autumn mist clung heavy to the Appalachian Mountains of West Virginia, wrapping the small town of Maplewood in a ghostly embrace. Through the fog, the weathered buildings of Main Street emerged like shadows from another time, their brick facades telling stories of boom years long past. Among these aging sentinels stood the Crown and Kettle, a diner that had served the community since the coal mines first brought prosperity to these hills. Thomas Jefferson Brooks, an 82-year-old black veteran, stood at his bedroom window, watching the sun struggle to pierce the morning haze. His dark hands, marked by age and decades of service, traced absent patterns on the windowsill as he contemplated the day ahead. In the soft light, the medals displayed on his dresser caught his eye. Bronze Star, Purple Heart, Vietnam Service Medal, each one a testament to sacrifices made in service of a country that hadn't always served him in return. Another day, he murmured to himself, a habit formed during long years of living alone. His wife Sarah had passed 5 years ago, leaving him to navigate his twilight years in solitude. Their children had moved away, James to Atlanta, Marie to Chicago, seeking opportunities that Maplewood couldn't provide. They called regularly, visited when they could. But it wasn't the same as having family close by. Thomas's morning routine was military precise, unchanged by decades of civilian life. Shower at 0600. Shave with careful strokes, despite hands that weren't as steady as they once were. Press his clothes with deliberate attention, Oxford shirt crisp and white. Slacks with a knife-edge crease. Shoes polished to a mirror shine. Some habits, drilled into a young soldier half a century ago, never faded. As he knotted his tie forest green, Sarah's favorite, Thomas's mind wandered to the conversation he'd had with his son James the night before. "Dad," James had said, his voice carrying concern even through the phone line. "You don't have to prove anything to anyone. There are plenty of other places to get breakfast." But Thomas disagreed. After 8 decades of life, 30 years of military service, and countless moments of swallowing his pride and taking the path of least resistance, something had shifted inside him. Perhaps it was age bringing clarity, or perhaps it was simply fatigue with the way things had always been. The Crown and Kettle had stood in Maplewood since 1952, serving generations of miners, teachers, doctors, and families. Its current owner, Frank Sullivan, had inherited it from his father 20 years ago. In all that time, certain unwritten rules had remained unchanged. Black folks could get takeout from the side window, but dining in, that wasn't done. Not in Maplewood, not at the Crown and Kettle. Thomas had driven past it thousands of times, watching through the large windows as people enjoyed their meals, caught the aroma of fresh coffee and sizzling bacon, heard the laughter and conversation spilling out whenever the door opened. He'd seen other black veterans turned away, watched them accept it with the same resigned shrug he'd given so many times before. The weight of those moments had accumulated over the years, like sediment building up in a river, until something had to give. Last week, he'd read in the local paper that the Crown and Kettle had won a state award for Best Traditional Breakfast. The article praised their homemade biscuits, their country gravy, their commitment to old-fashioned values and service. The irony of those words wasn't lost on Thomas. "Time to see just how traditional they want to be," he said to his reflection as he put on his veteran's cap, the 5th Infantry Division insignia gleaming dully in the morning light. He checked his appearance one final time. Everything had to be perfect. No excuse for anyone to find fault. It was a habit born of a lifetime of being judged more harshly than others, of having to be twice as good to be considered half as worthy. The drive into town was short, just 10 minutes along roads that curved through the mountains like veins through ancient stone. Maplewood was stirring to life, shopkeepers raising their shutters, early bird customers waiting outside the post office, and the first shift heading to what remained of the coal operations outside town. As Thomas turned onto Main Street, he noticed something unusual. A line of motorcycles parked in front of the hardware store. Not just any motorcycles, but serious machines, Harleys and Indians. their chrome and leather gleaming even in the weak morning light. A group of riders stood nearby, drinking coffee from paper cups and studying maps spread across their bike saddles. The sight gave Thomas pause. Maplewood didn't get many visitors, especially not this late in the season when the tourist traffic had died down. But he pushed the thought aside, focusing instead on his destination. The Crown and Kettle sat on the corner of Main and Cedar, its red brick exterior softened by decades of sun and rain. The neon sign in the window still proclaimed, "Open 24 hours," though everyone knew they closed at 9 these days. The morning crowd was starting to filter in, miners grabbing breakfast before heading to work, retirees gathering for their daily coffee clutch, families taking advantage of the Sunday morning special. Thomas parked his Buick carefully, making sure it was perfectly aligned between the faded yellow lines. Each movement was deliberate, measured, as if by doing everything exactly right, he could somehow ensure what was to come would go smoothly. He knew better, of course. 30 years in uniform had taught him that preparation could only take you so far after that. You had to face whatever came with courage and dignity. As he stepped out of his car, Thomas caught his reflection in the window. The man looking back at him was straight-backed despite his years, dignity written in every line of his face. His white hair was cropped close in military fashion, his clothes impeccable, his bearing that of a man who had commanded troops in combat. But would any of that matter once he stepped through those doors? The bell above the door chimed as Thomas entered, a cheerful sound that seemed at odds with the sudden tension that filled the room. Conversations stuttered to a halt like records suddenly unplugged. Forks paused halfway to mouths. Coffee cups clinked too loudly as they were set down with shaking hands. Betty Mason, who'd been waitressing at the Crown and Kettle for longer than most customers could remember, stood frozen by the register, her order pad hanging limply at her side. Her eyes darted toward the kitchen door, a movement Thomas noted with the tactical awareness that had kept him alive in Vietnam. For a long moment, nobody moved. The only sounds were the sizzle of bacon on the grill and the soft whir of the ceiling fans pushing around the smell of coffee and fear. Then the kitchen door swung open, and Frank Sullivan emerged, wiping his hands on his apron. He was a big man, running to fat in his later years, with thinning red hair and a face that had once been handsome before time and bitterness had carved their marks into it. His eyes narrowed as they fell on Thomas, recognition and something darker flickering across his features. "We're full up," Frank announced, his voice carrying the forced politeness of someone trying to maintain a fiction everyone could see through. "No seats available." Thomas let his gaze sweep the dining room, taking in the multiple empty booths and vacant counter seats. When he spoke, his voice was calm, measured, carrying the same tone he'd used to brief generals during his years at the Pentagon. "Seems to be quite a few open tables, Mr. Sullivan." The use of his name made Frank's face redden. "Those are reserved," he said quickly. "For regular customers. You'll have to try somewhere else." "Regular customers," Thomas repeated softly, letting the words hang in the air like smoke. "And what exactly defines a regular customer, Mr. Sullivan?" The question seemed to make Frank uncomfortable. He shifted his weight, glancing around at the other diners as if seeking support. Some looked away, suddenly fascinated by their coffee cups or the pattern on the linoleum floor. Others watched with undisguised interest, waiting to see how this confrontation would unfold. "Listen," Frank said, lowering his voice to a harsh whisper. "We both know how things work here. There's plenty of other places that would be happy to serve. Your kind. Why don't you just dash?" "My kind," Thomas interrupted, his voice still calm but carrying an edge of steel. "Would that be decorated combat veterans? Career military officers? Tax-paying citizens of Maplewood?" The door chimed again, and heavy boots thudded on the wooden floor. Thomas didn't need to turn around to know that some of the bikers he'd seen outside had entered the diner. He could feel their presence, sense the shift in the room's dynamics. Did I just hear someone use the phrase, "your kind," in 2024? The voice was deep, resonant, carrying the kind of authority that commanded attention. Its owner stepped into view, a tall man with iron-gray hair and a neatly trimmed beard, wearing a leather vest covered in military patches. His eyes, sharp and alert, took in the scene with the practiced assessment of someone used to sizing up situations quickly. Frank's face had gone from red to pale. "This is a private matter, Dash. Nothing's private when it comes to discrimination, friend." The biker's voice was friendly, but there was steel beneath the smile. "Name's Michael Connor. Most folks call me Iron Mike. And I couldn't help but notice you're giving this gentleman here some trouble about getting breakfast." More bikers filed in, 2 women and 4 men, all wearing similar vests adorned with patches. They spread out casually, not threatening but definitely present. Thomas noticed their patches: Vietnam Veterans MC, Combat Veterans Association, Purple Heart recipients. "Your establishment, your rules. I get it," Mike continued, his voice carrying clearly through the now silent diner. "But here's the thing, we're part of a group called Veterans United. We ride across the country, supporting our brothers and sisters who served. And it just so happens we're planning a big rally next week. Been looking for a place to host it." He paused, letting the implications sink in. "Originally, we were thinking about using the fairgrounds over in Charleston. But Maplewood seems nice. Real friendly town. Well, mostly friendly." His eyes locked onto Frank's. "Might bring 3, 400 bikes through here. They'd all need somewhere to eat. Of course." One of the female bikers stepped forward. Her vest identified her as Document, and she wore her silver hair in a tight military braid. "Course, we'd want to make sure wherever we choose to spend our money treats all veterans with respect, regardless of what they look like." The threat was clear, though delivered with a smile. Frank stood frozen, his face a mask of conflicting emotions: anger, fear, calculation. The morning crowd watched in tense silence, forgotten coffee growing cold in their cups. Thomas hadn't moved, his military bearing automatic in moments of tension. He'd faced worse, much worse, in Vietnam and during the civil rights era. But this felt different. This wasn't just about him anymore. "Mr. Sullivan," he said quietly, "all I want is breakfast, same as anyone else. Now, you can serve me, or you can explain to your customers why you're turning away business, not just mine, but that of hundreds of veterans who might be passing through." A young voice piped up from one of the booths. "Daddy, why won't they let that man eat here? He's wearing a soldier hat like Grandpa used to wear." The child's innocent question seemed to break something in the atmosphere. People began to shift uncomfortably in their seats. A woman at the counter gathered her purse and stood up. "I've had enough," she announced clearly. "My father died in Korea, fighting alongside men of all colors. He'd be ashamed to see this." She walked to the door, pausing beside Thomas. "Thank you for your service, sir." Then she was gone, the bell chiming in her wake. More customers began to stand, leaving money on their tables and walking out. Not everyone, some stayed seated, determinedly focusing on their meals, but enough to make a statement. Frank watched his customers leave, his face a mix of anger and fear. "You're ruining my business," he sputtered at Thomas. "No," Mike said quietly, "you're doing that all on your own." Betty, the waitress, had been watching the scene unfold with increasing distress. Finally, she stepped forward, straightening her apron with trembling hands. "Frank," she said, her voice shaking but determined, "I've worked here for 27 years, served thousands of people, never felt right about turning folks away. But I kept quiet because I needed the job." She took a deep breath. "Not anymore. Either you serve this gentleman, or I walk, right now." The kitchen door swung open again, and a young black man in a cook's apron emerged. Marcus Johnson had been cooking at the Crown and Kettle for 5 years, quietly enduring the knowledge that people who looked like him couldn't eat in the dining room where his food was served. "Same goes for me," he said firmly. "I'm done hiding in the kitchen while you turn away good people." Frank looked around wildly. seeing his carefully maintained world crumbling. The diner had gone completely silent, every eye fixed on him. In that moment, he faced a choice that would define not just his business, but his legacy in Maplewood. Thomas watched it all with outward calm, though his heart was racing. He'd seen this moment coming for decades, not just here, but in countless small towns across America. The moment when the old ways finally collided with the new, when people had to choose which side of history they wanted to stand on. Mike moved closer to Thomas, his presence solid and reassuring. "What do you say we all sit down and have some breakfast? I hear the biscuits and gravy here are pretty good." He looked at Frank. "That is, if the owner's willing to serve paying customers." The challenge hung in the air like morning mist over the mountains. Frank Sullivan stood at a crossroads, facing a decision that would ripple through his community in ways he couldn't yet imagine. The past and future collided in his diner on a Sunday morning, waiting to see which would prevail. Frank Sullivan's face went through a range of emotions: anger, fear, calculation, and finally, resignation. The silence in the diner was absolute, broken only by the soft hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the old clock above the counter. "Take whatever seat you like," he finally muttered, not meeting Thomas's eyes. Then he turned and disappeared into the kitchen, the door swinging behind him with a bang that made several customers jump. "Well now," Mike said, clapping Thomas gently on the shoulder. "How about we all get some breakfast? I believe there's a nice booth over by the window." The tension in the room began to dissipate, though not entirely. Thomas found himself seated in a comfortable booth, surrounded by his unexpected allies. The other bikers introduced themselves one by one. Besides Mike and Document, there was Big John, a former Marine who had to turn sideways to fit in the booth; Preacher, an Army chaplain turned motorcycle mechanic; Angel, a retired Air Force nurse; and 3 others who called themselves Hawk, Storm, and Shadow. Betty approached the table, her hands still shaking slightly but her smile genuine. "Coffee all around?" she asked, already setting down clean mugs. Her eyes met Thomas's. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "For all the years I stayed quiet." Thomas nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Sometimes," he replied, "the hardest part of doing right is knowing when to start." As Betty moved away to fetch coffee, Mike leaned forward. "So, Thomas, tell us about your service. That's a 5th Infantry Division cap you're wearing." For the next hour, as plates of eggs, bacon, and those famous biscuits appeared on their table, Thomas shared stories of his military career. He told them about Vietnam, about leading men in combat, about the friends he'd lost and the battles he'd fought. The bikers listened intently, occasionally sharing their own experiences, building bridges of understanding through shared sacrifice. In the kitchen, through the order window, Marcus was watching it all unfold. He'd been cooking at the Crown and Kettle since he was 22, taking pride in his work even while knowing the bitter truth about who could and couldn't enjoy it in the dining room. Now, as he prepared Thomas's breakfast with extra care, he felt something shifting in the air, like the first breeze of spring after a long winter. Word spread quickly through Maplewood. By lunchtime, people were driving by slowly, peering through the windows at the unusual sight of black and white veterans sharing a meal at the Crown and Kettle. Some looked angry, others curious, and a few seemed almost relieved, as if a weight they hadn't known they were carrying had been lifted. Around noon, Frank emerged from the kitchen, his face still troubled but somehow different. He approached Thomas's table slowly, like a man walking through deep water. "Mr. Brooks," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "could I have a word?" Thomas excused himself from the conversation and followed Frank to a quiet corner of the diner. The owner's hands were twisting his apron, a nervous gesture that made him look older and more vulnerable than he had earlier. "My father opened this place in '52. Frank began. "Everything I know about running a restaurant, I learned from him, including—" He trailed off, then forced himself to continue. including who we served and who we didn't. Thomas remained silent, letting the man find his words. When he died, he made me promise to keep the crown and kettle exactly as it had always been. Said change would ruin us. Frank's voice cracked slightly. But maybe some promises shouldn't be kept. It wasn't quite an apology, but Thomas recognized it for what it was. The first crack in a wall that had stood for generations. Your father lived in his time, he said gently. We live in ours. The question is, what kind of future do we want to build? Frank nodded slowly, then reached into his pocket and pulled out an old photograph. It showed a much younger version of himself standing proudly in front of the diner with his father. Dad always said this place was about tradition, he said quietly. Maybe it's time to start some new ones. As they talked, more customers began to filter in for the lunch rush. Some turned away when they saw Thomas and the bikers, but others came in purposefully, making a point of greeting everyone warmly. Among them was Reverend Walker from the First Baptist Church, who stopped by their table. Brother Thomas, he said warmly, it does my heart good to see you here. Long overdue, if you ask me. He turned to Frank. And Brother Frank, I believe this Sunday's sermon will be about breaking down walls and building bridges. I trust you'll be in attendance. The afternoon wore on, and the bikers showed no sign of leaving. They ordered lunch after breakfast, telling stories, sharing laughs, and making it clear to everyone that they considered the crown and kettle their temporary home. More veterans began to arrive. Word had spread through the local VFW and American Legion posts, bringing men and women who had served in various conflicts, all coming to show support. Around 3 o'clock, a reporter from the local paper showed up. Drawn by the buzz on social media, she took pictures and interviewed people, carefully documenting what was becoming a historic day in Maplewood's history. What made you decide to take a stand today? She asked Thomas. He thought for a moment before answering. There comes a time, he said slowly, when you look in the mirror and ask yourself what kind of world you want to leave behind. I fought for this country, bled for it. Seems to me I've earned the right to eat breakfast wherever I choose. The story would run in the next day's paper under the headline, Veterans Unite, a new dawn at the Crown and Kettle. But the real story was still unfolding, written in the small moments and quiet conversations happening throughout the diner. As evening approached, the autumn sun casting long shadows through the diner's windows, Thomas realized he had spent nearly the entire day at the Crown and Kettle. The breakfast crowd had given way to lunch, which had merged into an early dinner service. Throughout it all, Mike and his fellow riders had maintained their presence, creating a protective bubble of acceptance that seemed to expand with each passing hour. Marcus, the young cook, had outdone himself all day. Every plate that came from his kitchen was a masterpiece of diner cuisine, as if he was channeling years of suppressed pride into each meal. Around 5 o'clock, during a lull in service, he emerged from the kitchen and approached Thomas's table. Sir, he said, removing his apron, I just wanted to thank you. My grandfather used to tell me stories about trying to get served here back in the 60s. He passed last year. But Marcus's voice cracked slightly. He would have been proud to see this day. Thomas reached out and clasped the young man's hand. Your grandfather's generation planted the seeds. We're just helping them grow. As the day wore on, more subtle changes began to appear. Betty removed the reserved signs that had mysteriously appeared on certain tables earlier that morning. Frank, after several hours of nervous pacing and internal struggle, took down an old photograph that had hung behind the counter, one showing the diner's grand opening in 1952, with its clearly segregated entrance signs. Around 6 o'clock, an elderly white woman entered the diner, leaning heavily on a cane. She made her way directly to Thomas's table, her movements slow but determined. Mr. Brooks, she said, her voice quavering with age but clear. I'm Margaret Wheeler. I taught at Maplewood High for 40 years. She paused, gathering herself. Your daughter Marie was in my English class in '82. Brightest student I ever had. Thomas smiled, remembering Marie's stories about the teacher who had encouraged her love of literature. "I've been getting my coffee here every morning for decades," Mrs. Wheeler continued. "Watched a lot of good people turned away, never said anything, just kept drinking my coffee and grading my papers." She straightened as much as her aged spine would allow. "Well, I'm saying something now. May I join you?" The table was already crowded, but space was made. Soon Mrs. Wheeler was sharing stories about Marie's high school days, pulling out old class photos from her purse, creating bridges between past and present. As night fell over the mountains, casting the valley in purple shadows, Mike finally stood up. "Time we headed out," he announced. "Got a long ride ahead of us." But before leaving, he approached Frank, who had been alternatively hiding in the kitchen and hovering anxiously near the counter all day. "About that rally next week," Mike said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Think we've found our location. Assuming, of course, everyone's welcome." Frank looked around his diner at Marcus proudly working the grill, at Betty chatting easily with customers of all races, at Mrs. Wheeler still deep in conversation with Thomas. Something in his face shifted, like ice breaking up on a river in spring. "Everyone's welcome," he said firmly, and for the first time that day, he looked directly at Thomas. "Always will be from now on." Mike nodded, satisfied. "Good choice. Expect about 300 hungry bikers next Saturday. Hope you're ready to make a lot of biscuits." As the bikers prepared to leave, each one stopped to shake Thomas's hand or give him a hug. Doc pressed a business card into his palm. "Veterans United meets every second Thursday in Charleston," she said. "We'd be honored to have you join us." Thomas watched them go, their motorcycles roaring to life in the parking lot, chrome gleaming under the streetlights. The sound echoed off the mountains as they rode away, a rumbling reminder that change often comes with thunder. Before Thomas could reach for his wallet, Frank approached the table. "Your money's no good here today, Mr. Brooks." He paused, then added, "Or any other day. What happened this morning, I can't undo the past, but I can do better going forward." As Thomas finally prepared to leave, he found himself surrounded by well-wishers. People who had sat silently that morning now came forward to shake his hand or pat his shoulder. Some apologized for past silence. Others simply nodded in recognition of what had been accomplished. Outside, the mountain air was crisp with the promise of coming winter. Thomas stood for a moment, looking through the diner's windows at the scene inside. Marcus was teaching Frank how to make his grandmother's secret cornbread recipe. Betty was rearranging tables to make room for next week's rally. Mrs. Wheeler had taken up residence in a corner booth, grading papers and greeting customers like a self-appointed ambassador of change. The neon sign buzzed overhead, casting a warm glow on the sidewalk. But something was different. The old open 24 hours sign had been joined by a new one, hastily painted but clearly visible. "All are welcome." Thomas smiled, remembering something his drill sergeant had said long ago in basic training. The hardest battles aren't always fought with bullets. Today's victory had been won with courage, dignity, and unexpected allies. More importantly, it had opened the door for other victories to come. As he drove home through the gathering darkness, Thomas thought about calling his children to tell them what had happened. But that could wait until tomorrow. For now, he wanted to sit with this moment, to feel its weight and significance settle into his bones like the evening settling over the ancient Appalachian hills. Something had changed in Maplewood today, not just at the Crown and Kettle, but in the hearts and minds of its people. It wasn't the end of prejudice or the solution to all problems, but it was a start. Sometimes, that's all you need: a crack in the wall, a foot in the door, a small victory that opens the way for larger ones to come. The mountains loomed dark against the starry sky as Thomas turned onto his street. They had stood witness to centuries of human struggle, to the slow but inexorable march of progress. Today, they had seen another small step forward, another barrier broken, another piece of the long arc of justice bending toward its true course. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new battles to fight. But tonight, Thomas Jefferson Brooks, veteran, father, and catalyst for change, drove home knowing that sometimes the simplest acts, like walking into a diner and asking for breakfast, could help reshape the world. One small town at a time.